The first group involved in a project is the doing team. This includes the designer, programmers, which can be of different flavors, for example, UI, database, backend, and so on, and then, of course, testers. If you have a Scrum team, you have a Scrum Master. Scrum Masters are generally also part of the team. Then you have a project manager, and in a Scrum team, you have the product owner.
And then you have stakeholders. So what we are going to assume, and again, a bit of an obvious one, is that for all our processes that we're talking about, or our software development, we are always looking at a separation between a producer and the client, right? We are not in a position where we are actually producing for ourselves. I mean, I'm not likely to actually sit down and write a big system for myself, right?
A stakeholder is anyone involved in or affected by project activities. This is of course a very broad definition, but it is the definition commonly given. That means that stakeholders can be a project sponsor, which is the person that champions the project. Within an organization, this person is often in a manager position or maybe a senior project manager or similar. They are the person who believes the project should happen and who will go ahead, make a case for it and support the project. They are generally the primary stakeholder because they have invested a lot, not the least their personal credibility. Then you have the project manager who to an extent is a stakeholder but primarily deals with the stakeholders.
Then you have all sorts of support staff. So if you are dealing with a development project, you might have, for example, an IT department that you're interfacing with, or you might have a finance department, marketing, human resources, so all sorts of people who are not actually doing anything for you directly on a day-to-day basis by writing code or something like that, but they are people that you actually need to work with and that you need to have as stakeholders. You have the customers, so the people who actually want the product in the end are a major stakeholder. You have suppliers, so anyone who is either externally or internally providing you with goods or services. So like, let's say you have a project or some sort of system that requires audio engineering, right? You have audio engineering team in-house, and they are actually supplying you with their service for this, right? So they wouldn't necessarily be part of your team that you're looking at. And then you have also opponents to the project that are in a way stakeholders, right? You have people who think the project shouldn't happen or it shouldn't happen in that way, but they are affected or they are involved to an extent.
And finally, you have the project team itself.
They are very different in their level of how important they're probably going to be. We're going to think about primary, secondary, and tertiary stakeholders that are part of our life cycle. And this is important when we think about requirements. Who are the people that you're actually going to ask about their input for the requirements? That is why we're talking about stakeholders now. We need to also think about what each of the stakeholders need. So what is their level of involvement and what is their level of interest? And also what are their skills, where you have sometimes product owners who have higher level of skills or higher level of involvement in the development life cycle than others. And it really depends on, their abilities related to the entire process that would actually make them better or not so good product owners, right? And you can also be a good or not so good customer, right? You can be very good at actually making up your mind and describing what you need. So the skills are important, but also managing the expectations of people. So you are often going to be in a situation in any sort of project like that where people are hoping for things that they're never going to get, right? And are you going to disappoint them at the end, or are you going to actually address that at the beginning? That way you make sure that the project needs are met. So you overall want to determine the strategies for the stakeholders, how to keep them engaged. I've already talked about their needs, but also about their impact. So what you want to also think about when you gather requirements is when you are dealing with a group of stakeholders that are giving you requirements, who is actually going to be the person who decides in the end that this is an acceptable delivery. Because if you're going to go with the person who is actually not the decision maker, then you need to be able to judge in the situation whether that's a good strategy to have or not, right? Because sometimes the decision maker will greatly rely on the other person and be just happy to go with whatever they are saying, and sometimes they're not, right? So it will depend what is actually going to go into requirements based on that. So we need to see, okay, who actually does the work and who has the influence, who is going to be affected. Now, who is going to be affected is actually a very broad topic. If you have a very expensive project that just totally goes over budget, right, and the company sinks, then every single person in that company is going to be affected by the project, right? Does that mean that you should have asked every single person in the company, down to the cafeteria staff, whether that feature should be in the project or not, in the product or not? Probably not, right? So being affected is again a question of, are you tertiary, a secondary, or a core stakeholder?
You can also identify the stakeholders by speaking to obvious stakeholders, for example, the project sponsor, and get them to nominate further stakeholders. This might also be done by the customer, for example.
Then you need to prioritize the stakeholders. So what you're actually looking at is their power versus their interest. How much power do they have over your decisions or over the project as a whole? For example, can they just cancel the project at any point, or can they cut your fundings, for example? And then you have their interest. So interest being, how involved do they actually want to be? And based on that, you make the decision of where you actually place them on the grid. So if somebody has a lot of power and they're also highly interested, right? So they could cancel your project at any point now, and they also want to know everything about them. Then you need to manage them closely. You need to ask them to make sure you need to have, you need to have them closely involved in the requirements process. You need to make sure they're signing off on that, right? You need to make sure they're happy before it's actually finalized, and then they actually put their signature on it in the end. Whereas the other end would be someone with very little power. Again, somebody like some supplier, for example, right? A supplier would generally not have a lot of power over your product development, because the worst they can do is actually not supply you with their services, but they wouldn't be able to actually cancel your project or something. And their interest is probably also, I don't know, it depends on where it is, but either you just monitor or you just keep them informed. Basically, based on that, you plan the communication and you plan how you actually are going to interact with them in requirements gathering.
So when we try to understand our stakeholders, we need to consider what their interests in the outcome of the work are. How personally invested are they, but also why do they actually want this project to happen? And therefore we know what motivates them. We need to consider what information they want and how they want the information. Not everyone wants to know about absolutely every single detail that is part of any sort of project or software development. And they also don't necessarily want to have the information in an email format, for example. So often stakeholders would rather look for the information in a central way that they are familiar with. What is their opinion of your work? So have you worked with them before? Do they know you at all? Do they have any reason to think highly of you, or even on the opposite? Who influences them? That's interesting when you consider who are the influential people in a company and who would be the people who know most about a subject matter. These are often then also the ones who influence them. And if you know that, then you can win them over. But also there is an aspect where you might win someone over if you speak the language they understand. Some people understand, for example, financial arguments very well. Others think about efficiency or technical aspects more. And then again, the question is, who do they influence? So maybe you can get to someone else through them.